So the talk I'd like to present to you today focuses on the notion of preferences and opportunities and on the conceptual foundations of normative welfare economics. So the main idea is that normative welfare economics commonly assumes that the preferences of individuals can be reliably inferred from their choices and relies on the satisfaction of individuals' preferences as the normative standard for welfare. The idea is that individuals are well off, so their lives are going well for them to the extent that their own preferences are satisfied, and that different policies enhance individual welfare to the extent that these policies actually satisfy these people's preferences. In recent years, in the philosophy of economics and philosophy of science literature, a number of authors criticize preference satisfaction as a normative standard for welfare. And they advocated grounding normative welfare economics on opportunities rather than preferences. So the idea, according to these authors, is that we should rely on opportunities as the normative standard for welfare. And in their view, opportunities have value, have actually intrinsic value, irrespective of whether individuals reveal consistent and stable preferences. So the idea is that we should change the building block of normative welfare economics and replace the notion of preference as the key notion on which we ground normative welfare economic analysis with the notion of opportunity. Now, the debate between preference-based approaches and opportunity-based approaches has substantive policy implications. And the reason is that quite often preference-based approaches and opportunity-based approaches ground rather different evaluation of the implication of different policies. And even in those cases where preference-based approaches and opportunity-based approaches ground a quite similar evaluation, even in those cases, they actually ground their evaluation on this similar justificatory principle. So we really need to take a position, I think, on whether we want to ground, whether we think we should ground normative welfare economics on opportunities rather than preferences. And what I'd like to do in this paper is to actually engage the debate. And I will argue that although preference-based approaches do face significant conceptual and practical challenges, opportunity-based approaches fail to provide a more reliable and informative foundation for normative welfare economics. So at least to date, calls to replace normative welfare economics foundation with the opportunities rather than preferences actually do not withstand scrutiny. So I'm engaging a sort of qualified defense of preference-based approaches against the proponents of opportunity-based approaches. The contents of the talk are divided as follows. In the second section, I will outline the main tenets of preference-based approaches, and I will explicate the major challenges faced by these approaches. I will then move on opportunity-based approaches. I will outline the main tenets of these approaches, and I will explicate some major challenges faced by opportunity-based approaches. And in the final part of my talk, and we'll see how far I can go in that compatibly with the time we have, I will rebut influential calls for opportunity-based approaches to support my qualified defense of preference-based approaches. And in any slide, just to be sure, I typically tend to highlight with colors the keywords so as to facilitate actually reading and listening. Before actually engaging with the specific contents, a couple of preliminary remarks. First, I will use the expression preference-based approaches to encompass, and I will use it quite broadly, to encompass both approaches that take preference satisfaction to constitute welfare. Think of actual, informed, or ideal preference satisfaction theories of welfare, and also approaches that take preference satisfaction to provide merely evidence for welfare. According to these approaches, preference satisfaction does not constitute welfare, but can still be used as evidence for welfare, and therefore we should rely on preferences as the foundation for normative welfare economic analysis. I mean, the main author I have in mind here is Daniel Hausmann and his evidential account. Secondly, my critique of opportunity-based approaches is a critique specifically focused on the use of opportunities as a foundation for normative welfare analysis. This is actually compatible with advocating the use of opportunities for a number of analytical or practical purposes. So for instance, I have nothing against using opportunities for developing measures of freedom, as several authors try to do, or for using opportunities as development indexes like Amartya Sen and other people attempted to do. So I'm not engaging in a debate with those authors. I'm specifically engaging with those who actually advocate using opportunities as a foundation for normative welfare economic analysis. And finally, just as an aside, but to preempt potential concerns you might have, I'm aware that welfare enhancement is not the only goal of public policy that we may have. I mean, just think of the many other things that we try to promote or safeguard with public policy. Think of distributive justice. So I'm not arguing at all that welfare enhancement is the only thing we should be concerned with when we engage in public policy evaluation. My only assumption for the evaluation that follows is that the vast majority of the author involved in any of these debates on the foundation of normative welfare economics is welfare enhancement might not be the only goal, but is surely a central goal of public policy analysis, in the sense that, other things being equal, we should rather opt for a policy that enhances individual welfare, that improves individual welfare, rather than a policy that hampers individual welfare. This is the only minimal assumption on which my actually evaluation relies. So enough, I would say, for stage settings, and I'll proceed with preference-based approaches. The main idea behind preferences approaches is that individuals' preferences count as satisfied in a particular sense. They count as satisfied if the states of affairs targeted by these preferences actually obtain. So for instance, I have a preferences that Italy wins the Euro Cup, and my preference counts as satisfied only if actually the Italian team manages to win the Euro Cup, as luckily we managed to do last summer. Now, knowing that my preferences are actually satisfied might give me some pleasure, some sense of psychological sense of satisfaction. However, this is not the sense in which preferences count as satisfied in this technical term. In particular, preference satisfaction in this technical term does not necessarily have to involve any psychological feeling of pleasure or satisfaction. So these are not hedonistic account of welfare. And in fact, my preferences might count as satisfied, even unbeknown to me, even in cases where I actually lack awareness of the fact whether my preferences are satisfied or not. For instance, suppose I didn't know, or I psychologically removed the horrifying playoff for the World Cup that Italy recently played. My preference that Italy plays in the next World Cup is not satisfied, even if I'm not aware that these playoffs have already been played and unfortunately we lost them quite embarrassingly. Now, two exclusive sets of preference-based approaches can be distinguished in the literature. On the one hand, we find actual preference-based approaches, and these approaches take individuals to be well off to the extent that the actual preferences of individuals are satisfied. And by actual preferences, we mean the preferences that individuals happen to have as a matter of empirical fact. On the other hand, we find informed or ideal preference-based approaches, which take individuals to be well off to the extent that their own informed or ideal preferences are satisfied. And by informed or ideal preferences, we mean the kind of preferences that we would counterfactually have if we were not subject to limitation of information, cognitive ability, self-control, computational power, and so on and so forth. Now, according to the critics of preference-based approaches, neither actual preference-based approaches nor informed or ideal preference-based approaches actually provide a reliable and informative foundation for normative welfare economic analysis. Now, let me briefly unpack for you how the critique of preference-based approaches actually proceed in each of these cases. Consider actual preference-based approaches first. The critics proceed as follows. If welfare economists are to reliably identify individuals' preferences, namely the preferences on which they will then ground their welfare analysis, these preferences must satisfy specific consistency and stability requirements. By consistency requirement, I mean requirements such as transitivity. By stability requirements, I mean like a context independence requirement. And why do they need to satisfy this? Because these are the axioms on which the theorems and the representation theorems of which decision theory and welfare analysis are based. So unless an individual's preferences reliably kind of satisfy these sorts of axiomatic restrictions, well, we are not in the position to run actual preference-based approaches because we don't know how to actually derive the connection between preferences and welfare.
Excuse me, Roberto.
Yes.
Roberto, excuse me. There is a possibly a clarification question by Mirko.
Yeah, so just a quick one.
Yes.
You mentioned that preferences can be satisfied even if the individual is unaware of it. Then your example actually is negative in the sense that I have a preference. That preference has been violated because Italy lost and they will not participate, and I'm unaware of it. And I kind of get the negative side of it. I wonder if it also works on a positive. For example, I have a preference. I'm unaware that that preference is actually being satisfied by the status quo, but then I have absolutely no idea of that. And I wonder whether that also counts as a satisfied preference.
Thank you. That's a good question. Yes, that also counts. And of course, that might generate some problems for preference-based evaluation, on which we might discuss later, but that is correct. So suppose that I was, I don't know, a Portugal fan, but I'm not aware that the World Cup qualifier has already been played. My preference is that Cristiano Ronaldo plays in the next World Cup, unbeknown to me, or let's say Portugal, because maybe Cristiano Ronaldo will pick down quite quickly, who knows. But suppose that my preference is that Portugal qualifies for the next World Cup. My preference can be satisfied without me actually being aware of that. Now, let me be clear about this. Typically what happens is that we are aware that our preferences are satisfied or are not satisfied. But I emphasize this example just briefly. I mean, it's not central to my evaluation at all. I just emphasize it to drive a wedge between preference-based conceptions of welfare and the hedonistic kind of conception of welfare, according to which, well, I'm well off to the extent that I feel satisfied or I am satisfied. I mean, often preference-based approaches co-vary with hedonistic kind of approaches, but they do not necessarily do so. And in all those cases where I'm not aware of whether my preferences are satisfied or not, there is a clear case for seeing the division, the distinction between preference-based approaches and hedonistic approaches. That's the only thing I wanted to emphasize to really, I mean, indicate that the notion of welfare on which economists typically rely is not this psychological notion of satisfaction that you often find in psychology. That's the kind of division of labor that we find, so to speak, out there in the literature. Would this help, Mirko?
Yeah, that answered the question really well. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And as always, maybe Mario, keep an eye on the chat so that while I'm going on, if there are other people intervening, we can clarify these important and interesting questions on the way.
Fine. Just clarification question to everybody. If you have, and you can also speak up on your microphone and directly to Roberto, but only for clarification question. Good.
Perfect. Thank you. So let's come back to this critique of actual preference-based approaches. So the criticism is that, well, in order to perform these sorts of welfare evaluation on the notion of actual preferences need to satisfy all the axiomatic restrictions that are usually at the basis of preference-based accounts. The problem is that actual preferences, according to the critics, frequently fail to satisfy this requirement. And there is a huge literature in psychology and behavioral economics and experimental economics which documents that individuals' preferences occasionally, some people would even say frequently, violate these sorts of requirements. As a result, the critics say, actual preferences often actually, on top of these kind of failures in behavioral economics and experimental economics, actual preferences often track factors that seem prudentially irrelevant for people. For instance, think of the dependence of our preferences on frames, namely on how the choice options that you're facing are simply described, even when the information stays the same. And sometimes, the critics say, people's actual preferences even detract from our own welfare. Think of cases where we have antisocial preferences, or think of cases where my preferences are just ill-formed or not well informed about my choice option. I mean, I may prefer to drink this from this bottle ahead of me, but unbeknown to me, some Russian secret agent actually poisoned to my own detriment. And there is a case in which satisfying my preferences obviously have negative implication for my welfare. So in a nutshell, these are the main reasons, I would say, why actual preference-based approaches are deemed to be inadequate to serve as a foundation for welfare economic analysis. Let's move on to the more interesting case now, the informative or the informed or ideal preference-based approaches.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Just a quick, just an example. What would count as an antisocial preference, just to understand?
Yes, is when we are envious of other people, so to speak, or where we have preferences regarding our relative standing to regarding the standing of others. Okay, so the better you do, the worse I'm doing. And there is a huge literature on the aggregation of social preferences or antisocial preferences, and a debate as to whether we should actually incorporate the effect that our other people's welfare has on my own welfare into the definition of preferences. I mean, this is simply to say that in some cases, satisfying our actual preferences may not actually contribute to our welfare. I think the clearest example, if the example from antisocial preferences, you're not aware of the literature, I would really think that the best example is the example I just given of the bottle, okay? I think I'm thirsty, I have a preferences to drink from this bottle. Unbeknown to me, there is some poison in this bottle. If I satisfy my actual preferences, my life does not go well for me at all. In fact, I will get poisoned. Okay, so that's a clear sense in which satisfying the preferences that you happen to have does not reliably enhance, does not reliably improve your own welfare. That's the only thing, the only criticism I like to keep in mind there.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Let's move on the informed or ideal preference-based approaches. Now, these approaches, all that individuals have informed or ideal preferences, and the welfare economists can identify such preferences and therefore build welfare analyses that are more reliable than the analyses we have just seen that are grounded on actual preferences. Unfortunately, according to the critics, there are at least 3 reasons why informed or ideal preferences cannot serve as a plausible foundation for normative welfare economic analysis. First, it is hard to see what notion of informed or ideal preferences should be adopted unless we make substantive assumptions about welfare. I mean, I'll give you a very basic example, but there are many different kinds of informed or ideal preferences that you can think of. And some of them are just moderately idealized. For instance, I would say the preferences that really matters for welfare economic analysis, well, they are not really actual preferences because we have just seen the counterexample, but they are informed preferences. So you build some information requirement and you will see that your informed preferences will never be to drink from this bottle, because if you were informed, you will know that there is poison in this and you will not prefer to drink from the bottle. But other people think that even informed accounts of preferences face some sorts of objections, and they advocate using ideal preferences. So they are not just the preferences you would have if you would have somewhat more information about the options you have, but if you were all the information available, even regarding all the potential implications for your welfare. And the point is that, well, there is a huge variety of degrees of idealization you could adopt. And it's very difficult to identify among all of these possible sets of preferences you may wish to adopt exactly which ones are the relevant one for grounding welfare analysis, provided that, well, your actual preferences are vulnerable to counterexample. Secondly, related to this, the point is not just mere theoretical air splitting, because different criteria to identify these sorts of informed or ideal preferences single out different preferences. And as a result, you are likely to advocate different policies depending on which set of preferences you take to be as the relevant one. And on top of that, even identifying informed or ideal preferences does not by itself enable you to determine in all cases what is actually prudentially good for individuals. And one example of this comes from a very interesting book, The Community of Advantage by Bob Sagdan, very famous economist, but with many kind of contributions in philosophy, who's actually, by the way, the main critical target, as you're going to see, of what follows. There may be cases where even when you're able to identify informed or ideal preferences, these informed or ideal preferences might be context dependent. So they might suffer from exactly the same problem we have just seen before for individuals' actual preferences. And when that is the case, so the critics go, even informed or ideal preferences are not stable enough for you to establish a reliable link between preference satisfaction and individual's welfare. So this is a nutshell. The main criticism, it's a lot of literature summarized in a couple of slides to give you a flavor of what are the main reasons why a number of authors in recent years try to move away from preference-based approaches, foundation of normative welfare economics, and try to devise alternative foundation. And I will now expand in the slides that follow on the main alternative to preference-based approaches. And these main alternatives are the opportunity-based approaches. The main idea behind opportunity-based approaches is that normative welfare economics should be based on people opportunities rather than on individuals' preferences. Now, again, we have a technical definition of what it is an opportunity. So like we had a technical definition of preference before, which is not equivalent to the common sense definition of preference we might have. Also in these sorts of debate, we have a technical definition of opportunity, which might not be synonymous with all the way in which we speak of opportunities in day-to-day language. So let me briefly unpack this technical definition for you. An individual's opportunity within these approaches is something that this individual has the power to bring about if he so chooses. Now, on these particular approaches, the size and the richness of opportunity sets, of all the opportunities that you have, has intrinsic value as an element of your well-being. And in particular, the idea is that your opportunities have value, irrespective of whether the choices that you make can be rationalized in terms of stable and consistent preferences. So you really see with these quotes why these people are advocating using opportunities rather than preferences. They think preferences have a number of problems. They are often unstable and inconsistent. If we use opportunities, we can bypass, we can overcome these problems because your opportunities defined in the way we did have intrinsic value, even if your choices cannot be rationalized in terms of stable and consistent preferences. That's why opportunities constitute an alternative foundation in the view of these authors, mainly Sagdan and a number of co-authors, as we are going to see, overcome these sorts of problems faced by preference-based approaches. Now, let me emphasize this point because I think it's worth remarking. Opportunity-based approaches really sharply contrast with preference-based approaches. Because on opportunity-based approaches, what matters for you is really freedom of choice, namely having a number of opportunities rather than whether you satisfy your preferences. And in their view, satisfying your preferences has value only insofar as doing so increases your opportunity. So this is an important point, and I'll get back later to this with an example. According to the proponents of opportunity-based approaches, the crucial notion, the primitive in their system, in the notion of opportunity rather than preferences. So in their view, satisfying your preferences has value only insofar as satisfying your preferences increases your opportunities. If, for example, in some cases, you satisfy your preferences, but you do not increase your opportunities, according to this author, you are not better off. So the crucial primitive notion really is opportunity rather than preferences, according to this author. And the implication of this is that welfare economists should really change the way they do policy making, they do policy advice, because they should aim to increase opportunities of individuals rather than try to reconstruct and satisfy individuals' preferences. No matter whether they are actual preferences, informed preferences, ideal preferences, that does not matter. The only thing that really does matter is to increase the opportunity sets of individuals according to these authors. In what follows, I'm going to outline three main problems which I think plague these opportunity-based approaches. The first problem concerns the measurement of opportunities themselves. The second targets the alleged assumptions concerning the putative value that opportunities have. And my final objection concerns the notion of agency, which is actually presupposed by these opportunity-based approaches. So I like to spend a few minutes on each of these three criticisms that I have against opportunity-based approaches, and I will proceed in analytical order. Let's consider first the measurement of opportunities. According to opportunity-based approaches, a particular policy P provides more opportunity than another policy P prime if and only if this policy P contains all the options that the other policy does and something more that the individual might want. Now, an important twist in this proposal for defining and measuring opportunities is that one cannot really specify what opportunities one have independently of how others use their own opportunities, because the contents of my opportunity sets are determined, are a function of the choices that you make of your own opportunity set. I mean, consider the fact our choices are interdependent. The choice options that are actually open to me as opportunities depend on a number of choices you have already done in the previous kind of part of the decision tree, let's say. So my opportunities depend on the choices that you make, and also your opportunities depend and will depend on the choices that are making out of my opportunities. Now, there is an important implication of this, and Sugden is quite adamant about this. And by the way, I'm citing a number of works that Bob Sugden did over the last couple of decades. So this is an interesting kind of alternative to preference-based approaches, because it's a series of work developed over 2 entire decades in a series of top journals. The implication of this problem is that often we cannot specify in concrete terms what one has the opportunity to do, and opportunity remains an open-ended concept in this case, namely that my opportunity set depend on your choices and vice versa. Now, I have at least 3 objections to this proposal for measuring opportunity. First, this proposal does not enable us to compare non-nested opportunity sets. And this is a huge problem because, as other authors, for instance, Dan Hausman already noted, many sets in public policies are non-nested. What does it mean? Quite often, when we compare alternative policies, the problem, and namely what makes this discussion so difficult, so heated, is that there is no simple option that contains all the opportunities given by the others as a subset. But typically, some option gives you some opportunities, some policies, and then other policies give you some partly overlapping set of opportunities, but each of these policies contains some opportunities that are not contained by the other. So the sets are not nested in the technical sense, and therefore the criterion we just had for measuring them is silent as to which of these policies actually provides with more opportunities than the other. Secondly, and more seriously, it remains unclear what the basic metric for measuring opportunity is. And there is a huge literature on which I will spare you the details about measurability and underdetermination challenges for all the proposed ways of actually counting opportunities. So the idea is that we lack a metric for really counting how many opportunities we have and for measuring how diverse they are. I'll briefly tell you 2 intuitive issues here. First, counting opportunities. How many opportunities we have depends on how fine-grained the description of the option we have is. So consider the fact that my preference for Italy playing in the next World Cup might be. I can be more or less specific in the description of these kind of choice options. And depending on how specific I am, you may count as having more or less opportunities. And this is an issue because when we compare these different policies in policy making, we are never sure whether the degree of detail at which we are describing this policy option is the same. But every time this degree of detail is different, the counting opportunities is not really telling us much regarding how many opportunities people really have. Related to that, also measuring the diversity of opportunities that we are given can be extremely difficult. I mean, think about the opportunity of having different cocktails in a particular place. How diverse these opportunities are with respect to each other may depend on a huge number of classificatory issues, and depending on what position you're taking of them, also your measure of opportunity is going to vary. And thirdly, and I would say even more worryingly, the open-endedness, the open-ended character of the definition of opportunity makes it quite hard to define what counts as more or less opportunity in concrete policy contexts, which are the ones that you're targeting. And to see this, consider the notion of group opportunity. This notion is crucial in policymaking because when we are thinking as to which policies to implement, we are not going, when we are devising policies for thousands or even millions of individuals, think of lockdowns, we are not going one by one, one individual by individual. but we typically reason by groups and by group opportunities. So we never think when we are devising a particular policies, what's the opportunity set of each and all of the millions of individuals we are targeting. We are generally abstracting away from individuals and playing at the level of groups. According to Sagden, a group has the opportunity to do a particular thing when the members unanimously desire to do things to which they have particular entitlement within this situation. But the problem is that this notion of unanimity is very rarely, if ever, satisfying policymaking. And this puts an additional constraint, I think, on the possibility of putting into practice this notion of opportunity. So you see that the kind of objections I have here move from the more theoretical one, think of what is the basic metric for measuring opportunities, but they also face on top of this kind of theoretical challenges, challenges of application, of practical implementability of these sorts of approach. Let's move on and consider the value of opportunity. Opportunity-based approaches are premised on the idea that it is good that people are free to do what they want, when they want to do it, even if their preference is utterly incoherent and unstable. The idea, to repeat it, because this is a very important kind of passage in Sagden works, is that opportunity as intrinsic value as an element of well-being, so translated, should be the building block on which we build normative welfare economics, in the sense that opportunities as value, irrespective of whether your choices can be rationalized in terms of stable and consistent preferences. So really, what matters is whether I'm expanding your opportunity set rather than whether I'm satisfying your preferences. There are at least two problems that I can see with this kind of presupposition regarding the putative intrinsic value of opportunities. First, we as individuals do not generally ascribe intrinsic value to opportunity. Why is that? Think of all the situations where your own preferences are unstable and inconsistent, and you are aware that your preferences are unstable and inconsistent. In those situations, you rarely ascribe intrinsic property to the opportunity of satisfying your preferences, because you know that your preferences in a month from now, in the next choice situation, may be completely undoing whatever your preference is at the current moment. Related to that, and this is more of a descriptive point, the one that I just made, normatively speaking, I do not think that opportunities generally have intrinsic value in the way that is presupposed by this author. And to see this, just consider and ask yourself, what would actually be the value of opportunity that do not satisfy any of your preferences? This is an important question to ask, and I think I'll try to drive your intuition with a couple of examples. Suppose we are a very big department, okay? We are 60 to 70 people. We expanded crazily even during the pandemic. Now, suppose that my head of department were to knock at the door of my office now and tell me, Roberto, we have a wonderful opportunity for you. Take all the administrative workload of your colleagues in your hands. Surely this is something that is expanding my opportunity set, but I can guarantee to you that I have no preference whatsoever for taking on a task like this. Or suppose that you're more of a sport-like person and you were telling me, Roberto, I have a wonderful opportunity for you. I will now give you the opportunity to watch 10 times again in a row, Italy versus Macedonia del Nord, the wonderful football game that we just played the other week. Yeah, that's an opportunity, but you know what? I have no preference whatsoever for watching a game like that. In fact, I have quite a strong preferences for trying to forget as soon as possible about a football match like that. I should add, actually, in fact, so that you can see how lucky I am, that my last book of poems was exactly poetry about football and about the Euro Cup that we won with Italy, with the preface by Mario Sconcerti, which I think is a writer that some of you might know. And my book came out 2 weeks before the playoffs. So you can imagine how angry I am, because that basically sank whatever kind of marketing ambition I might have had with a book like that. But you see what the intuition is here, okay? So this author seems to be presupposing that the notion of opportunity has value. But in fact, I think that the real issue is the other way around, namely that opportunities have value only insofar as they satisfy preferences that we already have. But opportunities by themselves do not have any intrinsic value. And to see this, just consider those opportunities who do not satisfy any of your preferences. Now, there is a potential proposal you may have at this point. You may tell me, well, Roberto, fine. Opportunities do not have intrinsic value, namely they're not valuable for their own sake. But surely you could tell me opportunities have instrumental values in virtue of their capacity to enhance or track individuals' welfare. And if this is the case, maybe we can still ground normative welfare economics on the notion of opportunity, because opportunities have instrumental value, namely they lead to welfare. And this is the notion we are concerned with. I think that interesting work in this direction has been made by Sebastiano Bavetta and others in Italy. I mean, this is an interesting proposal. I think it's less indefensible, to put it like that, or more defensible, more plausible than the original proposal by Sagden. But even with this proposal, I have a couple of problems. The first one is that I think that in many cases, expanding your opportunity sets may actually hamper rather than enhance your welfare. And to see this, I'll give you a couple of examples. One is from individual decision-making. The other is from strategic decision-making. Individual decision-making, suppose that you were vulnerable to some sorts of addiction, okay? I'm expanding your opportunity set by giving you access to products or to experiences to which you're addicted. I can worsen your welfare by enhancing your opportunity sets. So not only in some cases, opportunities do not have value unless they satisfy some preferences that you have. In some cases, expanding your opportunity set may actually damage, reduce, hamper your preference, your welfare rather than improving it. Think also of a situation of strategic decision-making. There are some cooperative games that are such that in the very moment I add some particular options to the player, I'm transforming these cooperative games into non-cooperative games such as Prisoner Dilemma. And again, giving some additional options to player in situation of strategic interaction can change the nature of the game to the detriment of the players involved. If this is too complicated for you, forget the strategic decision kind of example, but just think of the individual addiction example, which I think is the most intuitive one. Now, on top of this, I think that when we play with public policy situation, we need to show that opportunities are collectively welfare enhancing rather than individually welfare enhancing. Okay, so just remember what I said before. If we are deciding whether to implement a lockdown or not, we are not going individual by individual to see what the welfare implication will be. We reason collectively. The problem is that on the opportunity-based approaches, showing that particular opportunities are collectively welfare enhancing would require us to convince each person separately that she benefits from the policy. And this is rather problematic, as you can guess, whenever we are involving statistical target, namely we know that our policy will involve a number of people, we don't know who they are. Think, for instance, of safety on the roads. We know that this will impact the health of a number of people. We don't know the identity of these people. We don't know who will be involved in accident or not. And it's also very problematic, namely it's not implementable whenever we are targeting vast population segments rather than specific identifiable individuals. So
I would have a
Stefano.
No, just to be clear. So now there is psychology on stage, right? Because you are talking about addiction. So how should I conceive preferences in this context?
Great question. So there may be a number of issues with preference satisfaction accounts of welfare as well. In this case, Stefano, you're correct. This objection, there will be mainly an objection for actual preference-based approaches. Think about it. I'm an addict. I do have preferences, let's say, for football matches to an addictive extent, not to make the usual example about cocaine. Whenever I have the option to watch a football match, I crave immensely for it. That's my actual preference, even though by doing that, I will derail completely my career, okay? That might not be my informed or my ideal preferences, okay? So you're perfectly correct, and I think to be the implicit gist of your question here, namely, Roberto, some of these things that you're telling us are obviously objections from opportunity-based approaches, but aren't they objections as well for preference-based approaches if you're playing with the net at the same height, so to speak, against both accounts? I agree with you. There are counterexamples also for a number of preference-based approaches, but not for all of them. So this is the sense in which I'm saying I'm providing a defense of preference-based approaches, but it's a qualified defense. I am not defending all preference-based approaches. In fact, I think some of them are pretty crap, namely actual preference-based approaches do not work. They are vulnerable to many objections, but not all of them are vulnerable to this example. So I'm not even saying that informed or ideal preference-based approaches are without problem. They do have problems. I'll try to defend them and play with them in other papers. But for the purpose of these specific projects that I'm engaged with, I think that the problems I'm explicating are disproportionately affecting opportunity-based approaches rather than at least the best available version of the preference-based approaches we have. This is a sense in which, although some of the problem I'm saying, you are perfectly correct, are also problems for some version of preference-based approaches. They do not plague all of them, whereas they seem to be adding against the vast majority, at least, of the version of opportunity-based approaches. Would this help, Stefano?
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. But that's a great question again, and thank you, because these questions are actually very helpful because they enable us to be on the same page in a number of important implications of things that I'm just stating or just glossing over in some particular passage. Let's move on the notion of agency on which these opportunity-based approaches are based. And then I'll try to accelerate to have at least a couple of minutes, I would say, on one or two defenses for the last section. Opportunity-based approaches rest on a specific account of individuals as responsible agents. And the idea is that one is a responsible agent in this technical sense presupposed by opportunity-based approaches, to the extent that each moment she identifies with her own particular action, namely whether they're past action, present action, or future action. And the idea is that you're a responsible agent to the extent that you endorse the decision made by yourself, whether or not this decision can be rationalized by coherent preferences, as we've seen. Now, notice that this notion of responsible agency is not some kind of additional twist or dispensable element of opportunity-based approaches, but it's an element that does provide philosophical underpinning by Sugden's own admission to opportunity-based approaches. And the reason is that the claim by Sugden is that the claim that any increase in opportunity is good for you, namely that opportunities have intrinsic value, rest on the assumptions that you as an agent are a continuous locus of responsibility in this technical sense. Namely, we can assume that your opportunities are intrinsically valuable for you only if you are a responsible agent in this sense, namely that at each moment you continuously identify with your own action in the past, in the present, and in the future. Now, I have against a couple of objections to this account of responsible agency. One is a descriptive objection, and the other is a normative objection. So you see how
Roberto.
Yes, Mario.
Now, does this notion of responsibility, is this compatible with the fact that I can change my mind and perhaps I repent about some action done in the past and I wouldn't do it again?
Great question. So that already partly preempts what I was about to say, but you have a good point. So I did press Bob Sugden. We had some interactions about this project. He would tell you, look, I'm not excluding at all the fact that people may change their mind because he wants to allow that preferences are unstable. In fact, one of the main reasons why he wanted to adopt these opportunity-based approaches is that he knows really, really well. In fact, he wrote part of the literature on behavioral economics. So out of a charitable interpretation, I have to respect the fact that he thinks that you can change your own particular views. The thing is that once we allow for this, it becomes unclear what does it mean to identify yourself with the choices you made once you think that, gee, that's not anymore the choices I will make anymore. The sense in which it will tell you, look, you identify with your action, past, present, and future is that you recognize that you were at that time the author of these particular choices, even though now you're not anymore that author. But let me get back to this because even if Sugden makes this move, I don't think he can go very far with the move. Okay, but that's a perfectly good objection, I would say, or at least a clarificatory request regarding exactly what does it mean to identify yourself with your own past action once you know that you don't want or you wouldn't do anymore these particular actions. Now, let me get back to the 2 points, and I'm actually elaborating what you are already actually envisioning here. Descriptively speaking, I think it's quite dubious that we are generally responsible in the sense indicated by account. As you just said, and I think implied, Mario, often we have really unstable preferences, and I don't really think that we really identify with these kind of preferences because we are aware of how radically our preferences has changed. I, for one, I don't think I'm a responsible agent in the sense identified by SAT. Secondly, it's actually, normatively speaking, quite unclear what exactly the normative implication of individuals being responsible in the sense that is presupposing will be. And in particular, I wonder why we should really privilege, we as welfare economists, as decision theorists, as a policy advisor, privilege the preferences of the acting self, whatever they are, however incoherent they are, rather than the self as a maker of plans or as a source of reflective judgment. So Sagden seems to be saying, look, the preferences that matter, the choices, the wants, the inclination that matters are the one you happen to have in this very moment. Whatever they are, irrespective of how incoherent they are with all the preferences you previously had and all the preferences you will come to have. But when we are trying to develop welfare economic analysis, I wonder, why should I give preference? Why should I give prominence better to these particular preferences I happen to have in all those sorts of situations where I'm actually trying to develop plans for the future or to engage in reflective judgment regarding the coherence of my preferences and whether actually there are any preferences that go over the other or some trends in my preferences, for instance. I mean, the idea I'm hinting at is that I think in this sense, Sagden is a bit playing with words, so to speak, because he speaks of this responsible agent. But what this responsible agent seems to be actually is an agent who implodes in the moment, so to speak. So what I think the opportunity-based approaches are risk doing here, they are risk dissolving individuals into a faceless being that stumbles through life, that just cares about the preference that they happen to have moment by moment, irrespective of whatever coherence, consistency, constraint we might want to impose on individuals' preferences. I mean, what's the point of caring about your own preferences in this particular moment or about the opportunities you happen to have in this particular moment when you know that, for instance, you're suffering from addiction problems, or when you know that you're suffering from instability or incoherence problems, and the opportunities you care about now are completely different or even logically inconsistent with the opportunities you just care about a moment ago or the opportunities we'll care about in the future. So I think that both descriptively and normatively speaking, this idea of responsible agents does not point to an idea of responsibility that seems to count as responsible in any sense of the word. And I mean, I know this is a technical sense of responsibility, but I just don't understand what's the normative importance of being responsible in this sense, rather than being responsible for that matter in any of the senses that we typically mean when we speak of people being responsible, namely taking responsibility for the choices that they're made, rather than just merely recognizing, yes, that's the choice I made at that time, and I'm identifying myself with my previous choices in this behavioral, purely behavioral sense. Let me proceed, I would say. Can I go on with 5-10 minutes, Mario, before we recap and open for the Q&A?
Yes, no, there is no hurry. We generally stay about 2 hours during our seminar, so you can leave, you can go on and speak even 15 or more minutes, and then there will be plenty of time for.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I'd like to move back now. Now that I've given you a panoramic view, so to speak, of preference-based approaches and their problems, of opportunity-based approaches and their problems, what I like to do in this final part of the talk is to briefly go back to preference-based approaches. And I will argue that although preference-based approaches do face significant conceptual and practical challenges, to get back to some of the interesting questions I already had, opportunity-based approaches do not actually provide more reliable and informative foundation for normative welfare economics. And so the calls to ground normative welfare economics on opportunities rather than preferences do not actually withstand scrutiny. Now, in the paper on which this talk is based, I defend my thesis against 3 influential objections. The objection from unfeasible preference identification, the objection from paternalism, and the objection from contractarianism. Now, I think that if I were to go on all of these 3 objections for today, I will put too much meat on the fire, so to speak, okay? I would rather focus on the first 2 objections and do them in more detail so that we are both aware here of what exactly I'm arguing, what the problem might be, rather than covering too much terrain. Because I think that maybe for some of you, already what I said so far might be relatively novel. So I'll prefer to focus on fewer problems and go into greater depth together with you and really make sure that we are all on the same page rather than throwing too many ideas at you. So for the purpose of the talk, I'll focus just on the first two objections. Of course, if you have further questions, then we can talk also about contractarians. So the first objection, the objection from unfeasible preference identification, proceeds as follows. You could tell me, fine, Roberto, you've shown that, well, I mean, and we've seen together that actual preference-based approaches really do not withstand scrutiny, but you are in the business of defending, as I think I said, some informed or ideal preference-based approaches. Now, you may say, these informed or ideal preference-based approaches do fit behavioral and psychological evidence better than actual preference-based approaches. So we grant that to you. However, you could tell me, well, there is no known psychological foundation. And I think some of you use quite revealingly the word, we are in psychology now with addiction. So you may tell me, look, Roberto, there is no known psychological foundation for these weird assumptions that individuals have stable and consistent informed or ideal preferences. I mean, what sort of psychological entities are these informed or ideal preferences? We don't see them in individuals' mind. We don't see them in individuals' brain. And moreover, you could tell me, even if individuals had counterfactually consistent and stable informed or ideal preferences, this very idea that you're advocating that the welfare economist can somewhat reconstruct such preferences is actually a mirage. I have two replies to this sort of objection. First, we have to be really clear as to what preference-based approaches are committed to and what preference-based approaches are not committed to. So let me briefly expand on this point. Preference-based approaches do not rest on the psychological assumptions that individuals have, so to speak, inner rational agent like Sagden, Infante, and others advocate that somewhat have informed or ideal preferences. More specifically, as Hausmann and others before me actually noted, one can advocate preference-based approaches and assume that individuals have some sorts of latent mechanisms for generating preferences without making any assumption as to what this latent process is. This is a very important point, namely, preference-based approaches can remain entirely uncommittal. They can remain entirely agnostic regarding what the neuropsychological foundation of preferences really are. This is a point I actually argued myself at length. If you're interested in the point, just give a look at my papers on the futile notion for true utility, 2013, in economics and philosophy, and futility exposed in philosophy of science, 2019. The point is that I may have to assume that some sort of mechanism may underlie my preferences without making any assumption, so remaining completely agnostic regarding what this mechanism might be. So these are criticism that, gee, we are committed to particular psychological models of reasoning just does not withstand scrutiny. In fact, I think that the critics of preference-based approaches in this particular respect are failing to understand what exactly the implication of what the commitment of preference-based approaches actually are. Namely, these commitments are much less metaphysically and evidentially heavy than the critics assume. Secondly, welfare economists may reliably demarcate some subset of welfare relevant reference, even in some cases where actual preferences are inconsistent and unstable. I mean, I'm emphasizing not always, not everywhere. In fact, they're often unable to do so, but at least in some cases of inconsistent and instability, welfare economists have devised interesting methods for trying to demarcate welfare relevant preferences, even in these particular cases. I mean, I mentioned here Bernheim. There are Salant and Rubinstein, but also Marco Mariotti did very interesting works. There are two main sets of models here. I'll just mention them for you. No need to go into any of the details here. But there are both model-based and model-free approaches in normative welfare economics, especially at the frontier of research now, that try to determine what welfare-relevant subset of preferences might be, even in cases where actual preferences are inconsistent and unstable. Basically, there are different strategies of elimination that enable you through consistency requirement of getting rid of preferences that likely are mistakes, namely preferences that are unlikely to actually represent and track what your welfare is in the situation. Now, let me be clear here regarding what my defense is. I am not denying by any means that the identification of informed or ideal preferences requires you to rely on particular theories. So my point is not that, gee, somehow the proponents of informed or ideal preferences are able to do some magic, and without relying on any theory of welfare, they're able to provide you with some sort of welfare evaluation. In fact, quite the opposite. I explicitly argued actually last year in the Journal of Economic Methodology on Well-being and Public Policy that they either do proffered attempts to identify informed or ideal preferences without relying on any theory actually failed. So I'm explicitly granting that if we are to identify informed and ideal preferences rather than the actual one, we do need some theory, okay? So I'm not denying that we need to rely on theory. So I'm implicitly granting the fact that, gee, there are going some contested assumptions that we will need to make in order to identify this subset of preferences. My point, however, is twofold here. First, this theory dependence reflects the thickness of welfare rather than any kind of limitation into preference-based approaches. What do I mean by thickness of welfare? I mean that welfare is a thick rather than thin notion, which means when I'm ascribing welfare to you, I'm unavoidably making some normative judgment. I'm making the judgment that you have something which is worth having. Given the fact that we are already by definition in normative territory, there is no surprise that we are depending on some theory of other, but this theory dependence reflects the nature of the notion we are concerned with, the notion of welfare, the notion of what is non-instrumentally good for you and for your life, rather than any limitation in preference-based approaches. Related to this, if this theory dependence is really what worries you and keeps you awake at night, well, I don't really see what kind of problem you solve if you actually adopt opportunity-based approaches. Why? Just think back of all the objection I put forward against opportunity-based approaches. Many of them are theory-dependent objections. So the problem is that if you're really concerned with theory dependence, well, you don't really solve this problem by opting for opportunity-based approaches rather than preference-based approaches. I think here that the most productive way forward is what are the theories on which our judgment should be dependent? What are the most defensible theory rather than trying to, follow an idealistic utopian idea of theory freedom that is not to be achieved and is not to be achieved because of the very nature of the notion we are playing with, namely welfare, which is a thick notion. Let me play with the objection from paternalism, and then I think I'll prefer to wrap up, Mario, so that we maximize the time of the discussion. And I also think that some people, especially if you're not already familiar with this debate, you will think enough, Roberto. So the objection from paternalism proceeds as follows. Suppose for the sake of argument, you may grant me that informed or ideal preference-based approaches enable us to reliably identify consistent and stable informed and ideal preference. Okay, so suppose that you really wanted to be charitable with me and you tell me, fine, Roberto, I mean, we grant you, okay, that somehow economists become really smart and philosophically sophisticated and they are able actually to identify these informed and stable ideal preferences. Even so, you could tell me, these informed and ideal preference-based approaches encourage really questionable paternalistic policies on the part of the decision makers and the policymakers, namely policies that are designed to move people not to satisfy the preferences they happen to have, but in direction they would counterfactually go if they were fully rational. I mean, you could tell me the following, right? Okay, fine, Roberto. So let's stay away from actual preference-based approaches because they are untenable. Let's grant you that you can identify these informed and ideal preferences that people may or would counterfactually have. But if you ground normative welfare economic on these informed or ideal preferences, surely, Roberto, you face this obnoxious problem of paternalistic intervention that we are typically facing, namely that you are violating people's autonomy without asking for their consent for the sake of your own welfare. And this is really problematic. So the idea you would have is that on these informed or ideal preference-based approaches, people often make inferior decisions just because they're irrational. They have all these problems that behavioral economics and psychology show us. And these sorts of mistakes, in turn, license a number of questionable paternalistic interventions. So you could tell me, even if we were able to identify stable and consistent informed or ideal preferences, we should not really ground normative welfare economics on this notion, because if we were to do so, we will end up in having a really invasive and problematic set of paternalistic interventions. I have two main replies against this objection. First, might seem relatively trivial, but let me state it because I think it's worth discussing. Paternalistic interventions are frequently unjustified, but they are not generally or ipso facto unjustified. I mean, this might seem trivial, but it's worth remembering that even people who are generally against paternalistic intervention, like I am, grant that there are a number of cases where paternalistic interventions are justified. Simple example, compulsory schooling, compulsory seatbelt laws, compulsory lockdown for that matters, that there have been at least some stages in the pandemic where I think these lockdowns decisions were sacrosanct. I mean, we may discuss regarding how severe they should be, how long they should last, and so on. But it was obvious to me and to many, I think, that at least at some point, some lockdown was needed, especially during the first and the second wave before we had the vaccine. What is the point here that I'm making? The point I'm making here is that merely labeling some policies as paternalistic does not yet count as an objection against the policy. You need to show that the policy is questionably paternalistic. Merely mean paternalistic is not in itself an objection against a policy. And this, by the way, is a point that is often made in the literature, and I'm speaking of the philosophical literature, where many people think that we shouldn't discuss policies generally as being, paternalistic and therefore unjustified, and non-paternalistic and therefore being justified. Rather, we should discuss paternalistic policies on a case-by-case basis, or at least on a type-based basis. For instance, we may want to discuss and assess paternalistic policies depending what is the sort of intervention they involve. Typical example, consider means paternalism versus end paternalism. Other things being equal, means paternalistic intervention, namely paternalistic intervention that tamper and manipulate your means, the means you use in order to achieve your own ends, other things being equal, are less problematic than end paternalistic intervention, which change not just the means you use in order to achieve your own ends, but also change the very ends that you're trying to achieve. Because other things being equal, end paternalistic intervention are even more invasive than the means paternalistic one. This is just to say, we need more refined, more sophisticated ways of evaluating policy intervention just than labeling them as paternalistic. So the objection from paternalism need to be refined, so to speak, into an objection from objectionable paternalism. Second point related to this, I think that the proponents of informed and ideal preference-based approaches do not generally encourage unjustified paternalistic intervention. In fact, when we look into the literature, we find that the proponents of informed and ideal preference-based approaches have a number of both welfare-related and non-welfare-related reasons to oppose paternalistic intervention. I'll give you an example of each of these two sets of reasons, and then I will conclude in the interest of our Q&A and of our own relief. An example of welfare-related reasons. Many people who are in this literature, myself included, recognize that paternalistic interventions often fail to enhance the welfare of the involved individuals. There are a number of situations where third parties who are intervening think that they are improving the welfare of the subject that they are actually targeting, but they are not very well informed about their welfare. And in many of these situations, these sorts of intervention may aim to enhance the welfare of the target agents, but fail to do so. This is already a welfare-related reason for opposing paternalistic intervention, which is perfectly compatible with advocating an informed or ideal preference-based approach. Secondly, we also have some non-welfare-related reasons for opposing questionable paternalistic intervention consistently with informed and ideal preference-based approaches. For example, even in those cases where paternalistic intervention manage to enhance individuals' welfare, they often manage to enhance individual welfare only because they involve an acceptable violation of people's autonomy and own consent. And whenever this happens, the proponents of informed and ideal preference-based approaches actually can consistently advocate respecting individuals' informed or ideal preferences against intervention. And that's exactly what I tried to do in a previous paper of mine on the notion of paternalism, one of those published in Social Choice and Welfare. The idea is precisely that, gee, fine, it's correct. In some cases, paternalistic intervention does, there is a trade-off between welfare enhancement and respect for individuals' autonomy and consent. But when this happens, nothing forces me from within the preference-based approaches to actually advocate welfare enhancements at the expense of individuals' autonomy and consent. I can consistently advocate informed or ideal preference-based approaches and still reject paternalistic intervention in all of those cases where I think that under a particular criteria to be specified, to be discussed, to be determined in discussion with others, are actually, these interventions are unjustified. Let me skip over the political philosophy section of the paper because it will, I think, really be too much for today. Let me briefly conclude. In recent years, I think I've tried to illustrate that some prominent authors, more specifically Sarden, but the number of co-authors that Bob actually had over the last couple of decades in a number of really top journals and contributions in the philosophy of economics and philosophy of science literature. A number of prominent authors criticized welfare economists' reliance on preference satisfaction, and they advocated grounding normative welfare economics on opportunities rather than preferences. I mean, these, if we were to go through, will be a Copernican revolution in the way we do actually normative welfare economics. In this paper, I argued that although preference-based approaches face both conceptual and practical challenges, so I'm willing to grant this much without any problem, still opportunity-based approaches fail to provide a more reliable and informative foundation for normative welfare economics than preference-based approaches. And I then rebutted the number of influential calls to grant normative welfare economics on opportunities rather than preferences to support my qualified defense of preference-based approaches. And I really emphasize this is a qualified defense, both because I'm not in the business of defending all of the preference-based approaches, but only a subset of them, namely the informed and ideal ones. And also is qualified because I'm not denying that even informed and ideal preference-based approaches face some challenges. I'm simply saying that from what we have seen so far in the literature, opportunity-based approaches have not been shown to be superior or preferable to preference-based approaches. Here is where I stand, and thank you so much for the attention, and I very much look forward to your questions. Thank you.